Today we're going to talk about Saul's defeat. So, when King Saul first began to rule over Israel, he obeyed God's command to banish the witches and the wizards from all of the land. He made it illegal to get in touch with them, to consult them about anything. And God had warned the people of Israel through Moses many years before about the dangers of witches and spiritual mediums. He had told them that they were tools of Satan to lead people into all kinds of evil. And God commanded his people to put death to all of the witches in their land. This is recorded in scripture for us in Leviticus 20:27. Well, it's still God's will today that Christians have nothing to do with witches and astrology and horoscopes and Ouija boards, anything else that has to do with evil spirits, because these are of Satan, they're not of God. But for years, Saul had been far away from God. So when he heard that the Philistine army was marching into Israel for battle, his heart sank, especially when he realized how many soldiers there were in the Philistine army. He knew that humanly speaking, there was no way the Israelite soldiers could have victory over such a huge army that was heading their way. So poor Saul, he desperately needed help from God, but he had not been on speaking terms with God for a long time. He had been going his own way and disobeying God's commands and fighting against God's will in his life. And since the prophet Samuel had died, Saul knew that he couldn't ask him for advice, and the priests couldn't help him. And there was just no way Saul could find out what he should do. There was no need to pray, for God didn't answer his prayers anymore. Well, the Philistine army had marched into the land of Israel, and they had spread out in the valley, and they were prepared to fight. And the Israelite soldiers had made their camp at Mount Gilboa, which was south of Shunem. Well, Saul needed to know soon what to do. Should they fight? Should they surrender without fighting? And as Saul thought about it, he decided that maybe a witch could bring back the prophet Samuel from the dead to give him advice. Oh, King Saul had fallen to deep depths to consider this. He asked that a witch be found for him to talk with. His servants asked around, and they found that in the village of Endor there lived a witch, a woman who supposedly called for spirits of the dead and supposedly talked to them. Well, Saul felt that if he could just talk to Samuel, who was now dead, then Samuel would know what to do, and he would be ready, Saul would be ready for his confrontation with the Philistine army. So, disguising himself so that no one would know him, Saul took two of his trusted servants with him, and they headed to Endor in the darkness of night to find this witch. Well, it was a dangerous journey that they were going because the Philistine camp was between their camp and Endor. So they had to secretly make their way around the army of the Philistines in order to reach the destination they were headed to. But Saul was very desperate for help, so he was willing to take the risk. He trusted the darkness to conceal him and hide him from the enemy, and they made their journey, and they finally arrived at the witch's house. Well, the witch was surprised to have visitors in the middle of the night. Not only surprised, but also frightened, for King Saul had long ago commanded that all of the witches be banished to death. So she had been very secretive about her witchcraft, and she'd been hiding it from everyone the best she could. She was always afraid that somebody would betray her and tell where she was and that she'd be killed. So she asked these late night visitors if she would be reported and punished. And Saul promised her that she wouldn't be. And then he told her that he wanted her to contact the prophet Samuel. Well, of course, the prophet Samuel had been dead for some time. Well, those who are witches claim to bring back the spirit of the dead people to communicate with the living people. But in reality, they communicate with evil spirits that imitate the voices of the dead. But this time, God chose to move in this situation and make it different from the usual experience of the witch. God allowed Samuel to be truly brought back in order to give King Saul a message. It's comforting to know that God is also God over the devil and all evil spirits. God can do whatever he chooses. And this time, God chose to interfere with the usual procedure of evil spirits imitating voices of people. And God allowed Samuel to actually return from the dead to talk to Saul. And when the witch saw the form of Samuel, she screamed in terror because she wasn't accustomed to seeing a form, only hearing voices. And when she realized that the man who had come to her house was really King Saul himself, she cried, "Why have you deceived me? You're King Saul." But King Saul assured her, "Don't be afraid. Tell me what you see." So, trembling, the witch replies, I saw forms ascending out of the earth. It was like the form of an old man covered in a mantle. Well, Saul knew that it was indeed Samuel, and he bowed before this form of the former prophet of God. And Samuel said unto Saul, "What have you done? What are you doing to bother me, to bring me back?" And Saul answered him, he says, "I'm very distressed, for the Philistines are making war against me, and God has left me, and he doesn't answer me anymore. So I called you to find out what I should do." "Well, why are you calling on me?" asked Samuel, "since the Lord has departed from you and became your enemy. The Lord has torn the kingdom from you, and he's given it to David, just as I told you. Remember, Saul, because you were disobedient. The Lord's going to let the Philistines win the battle. You and your sons will be with me tomorrow." Well, this was a tragic message for Saul to hear, not what he was expecting, and it demolished him with fear. And he fell on the ground, very, very much afraid. So, being physically weak from lack of food and from that journey that he had taken through the night, now he has heard this terrible news. So, all of his energy leaves him, and he just lays out on the ground. Well, the witch of Endor and Saul's two servants tried to help him by persuading him to eat something. Quickly, the witch prepared a meal, and at first Saul refused to eat, but finally he agreed. And Saul and his two servants ate the food that she had prepared, and this gave them the strength to make their journey back to camp during the night. Well, the next day, the Philistines went to battle against the Israelites. Scripture lets us know that it was a terrible battle for Israel. Soldiers with bows and arrows severely wounded King Saul, and in the battle, David's dear friend Jonathan, remember Saul's son, and Jonathan's two brothers were all killed. And Saul cried out to his armor bearer, "Take your sword and kill me quick before these heathens do it." But Saul's armor bearer was afraid to kill the king. So King Saul, fearful that he would be tortured by the enemy, fell upon his own sword, and he killed himself, committing suicide. When his armor bearer saw that Saul had killed himself, then he fell upon his own sword and committed suicide. So that day, Saul and his three sons all died in battle, just as the prophet Samuel had said would happen. The battle for Israel went so poorly that day that the people of Israel had to flee their city as the Philistines came to occupy them. When the Philistine soldiers came to strip the dead bodies on the battlefield, they found among the dead bodies that of King Saul and his three sons, strewn among the Israelite army. Scripture tells us that they cut off Saul's head, and they brought it with Saul's armor to the house of their god Ashtaroth. They fastened Saul's body and the bodies of his sons to the wall of Bethshan, where all of the Philistines could see and rejoice over their victory over Israel. It was their big trophy and their idol to prove that their idols were stronger than the God of Israel. Well, there were a group of brave soldiers from Jabesh Gilead that heard about this, and they set out in the night, at great danger to themselves, to get the body of King Saul and the bodies of his three sons from the house of the Philistine god of Ashtaroth. And once they accomplished their goal, then they respectfully buried them in the land of Israel. Well, on the third day, a young Amalekite, wearing torn clothing and with earth upon his head, came running breathlessly into Ziklag, where David waited anxiously for news of the battle. David had felt great concern for the people of Israel, wondering how Israel was doing in the battle and what had happened to King Saul and what had happened to his dear friend Jonathan. Well, it was obvious that the Amalekite was bringing tragic news. So David asked, "Where did you come from?" The young Amalekite answered and said, "I escaped from the camp of Israel." "How did the battle go?" questioned David anxiously. "Please tell me quick." "Well, the people of Israel have fled from the Philistines," he answered, "and many of the people of Israel are dead. King Saul and his son Jonathan are dead also." Well, David demanded to know, "How do you know they're dead?" Well, the young man, hoping to get a reward from David, explained, "Well, I happened to come to Mount Gilboa, and I saw Saul being pursued by horses and chariots. He was wounded and in anguish, and when he saw me, he asked me to kill him. So I did, because I knew that he couldn't live, and I have brought you his crown and his bracelet." Well, the Amalekite then handed David King Saul's crown and bracelet, and David recognized them as belonging to the king. So he knew it was true. King Saul and his son Jonathan had been killed in battle. David tore his clothes to show his grief, and his men did the same, and they mourned and they wept together. They didn't eat any food all day till the next evening because of the great defeat that had happened to Israel and her leaders. The young Amalekite who brought the news was kept under arrest until evening, when David called for him. "How is it that you are not afraid to stretch forth your hand against the Lord's anointed?" David asked. The Amalekite, who claimed to have killed Saul, had expected to be rewarded for his deed, but instead he was put to death. Instead of rejoicing that the great enemy King Saul was dead, David wept over King Saul and the fallen leaders of Israel. This showed that David was truly a man after God's own heart. David sang a psalm of praise about the exploits and character of Saul and Jonathan. David forgot Saul's treachery against him and remembered only Saul's great deeds when he was a younger king, before he was consumed by jealousy and hatred. These are some words that David sang as recorded in Psalms for us. "The beauty of Israel is slain upon thy high places. How are the mighty fallen! Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided." David sang a special lament for Jonathan, who had been such a true friend to him. How sad he was to lose such a good friend as Jonathan. Well, David had refused to harm King Saul, even when he had chances to put him to death, for David had chosen to leave vengeance to God, knowing that it would be wrong for him to take matters into his own hands and harm God's anointed king. In God's good time and way, God moved Saul out of the way, and in God's time, he would make David king over Israel as he had promised. As we study the life of David, we see how important it is to trust God and let him work on our behalf. When David forgot to trust God and took matters into his own hands, he got into all kinds of trouble, and we will too if we try to manage things on our own. We're to let God take care of any enemies that we might have. We're not to get back at them. And just as God took care of David's affairs when he trusted in him, God will also take care of us when we trust in him. So let's ask God to help us trust him every day in every way.